Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice, Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. 10 godina nakon što su diplomatski odnosi Saudijske Arabije i Sirije u potpunosti prekinuti, postoje nagovještaji da bi se to moglo promijeniti. Naime, nedavno je u Damasku boravio šef obavještajne službe Saudijske Arabije Halid bin Ali al-Humejdan i sastao se sa predsjednikom Sirije Basharom al-Assadom i šefom sirijske obavještajne službe generalom Alijem Memlukom. Razgovarali su o ponovnom otvaranju Saudijske ambasade u Damasku, uspostavljanju diplomatskih odnosa dvije zemlje i o obnovi ratom razorene zemlje. Sastanak je uslijedio samo nekoliko sedmica nakon što su se saudijski zvaničnici susreli u Bagdadu sa iranskim zvaničnicima u pokušaju da unaprijede odnose. U ovoj emisiji analiziramo zbog čega se Saudijska Arabija, koja je godinama podržavala i naoružavala sirijske pobunjenike, sada želi pomiriti sa režimom Bashara el-Assada. Razgovaramo o tome zašto je Iran bitan u cijeloj ovoj priči. Prije razgovora sa našim gostima pogledajmo uvodni prilog.
Predsjednik Bashar al-Assad na vlasti je već 21 godinu, a sada je na pragu da osvoji još jedan 7-godišnji mandat. Ima dva mahom nepoznata protivnika, kojima niko ne daje ozbiljne izglede i koji se ne bi mogli ni kandidovati bez odobrenja režima. Nikome od predstavnika opozicije koja je u izgnanstvu kandidatura nije bila dopuštena.
Postoji nekoliko pravnih, ustavnih i sigurnosnih prepreka koje dijelu stanovništva Sirije onemogućavaju učešće na izborima. Riječ je o raseljenima na sjeveru države, ali i onima koji žive u području pod kontrolom režima, jer ni oni nemaju slobodu da glasaju ili se kandiduju.
Milioni ljudi koji ne žive na teritorijama pod kontrolom vlade mahom su na sjeveru zemlje. Ne žele na izborima Assadu davati legitimitet. Nazivaju ga zločincem i optužuju da je tokom 10-godišnjeg rata kriv za ubijanje i hapšenje desetina hiljada njihovih sugrađana. Izbori neće donijeti trajno rješenje. Milioni Sirijaca su izbjegli i lagano gube nadu da će se jednom vratiti u svoje domove. Neki se plaše odmazde dok god je Assad na vlasti. Drugi se ne žele vratiti u Siriju zbog loših životnih uvjeta. Assad možda vjeruje da je pobijedio u ratu, ali sirijska privreda je u kolapsu. Proces rekonstrukcije još nije počeo. Novca nema, a međunarodna zajednica ne želi sarađivati s njim.
Rusija će ovo iskoristiti kako bi proglasila kraj rata i početak normalizacije odnosa Sirije sa susjedima i međunarodnom zajednicom. Reći će da je to u skladu s rezolucijom Vijeća sigurnosti 2254.
SAD i brojne druge zapadne države se s tim ne slažu. Njihov stav je da izbori nisu pošteni i da nije omogućeno sigurno okruženje za učešće na izborima.
Politički proces koji bi kulminirao slobodnim i poštenim izborima u skladu s novim ustavom morao bi biti proveden pod nadzorom UN-a.
Assad je dosad odbijao suštinsko učešće u tom procesu jer bi proces političke tranzicije značio da će izgubiti dio vlasti. On na to nije bio spreman ni kada je njegov režim prije nekoliko godina bio pred kolapsom. Njegov stav je da svijet mora prihvatiti realnost stanja na terenu.
Idemo sada do Londona gdje se nalazi Kamal Alam, stručnjak za Siriju. Kamal, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, Saudi Arabia's intelligence chief recently met with Syria's President Bashar al-Assad and Syria's intelligence chief General Ali Mamluk. For someone such as yourself who has been following Syria closely over the past 10 years, how surprised are you that the Saudis, who have been for years arming and financing some of the most militant Syrian rebel groups, how surprised are you that they are now trying to mend ties with Assad? Why now?
So actually this has been going on for the last few years. There's been a very quiet and discreet dialogue between Riyadh and Damascus for 3-4 years. They've met in Oman before, they've met in Iraq as well. Perhaps 3 years ago the Saudis realized and changed their policy where they stopped actively supporting the groups that were fighting the Syrian government. And then following that, they began a quiet dialogue, first mediated by Oman in Muscat, then in Iraq, and then finally the trip to Damascus. They've been working on their embassy as well. Their embassy is more or less ready to be opened. If you go to Damascus, the embassy's been cleaned, painted, and the local staff have got it ready So I think especially MBS has realized that it became quite evident after 2015-16 that Assad is here to stay. And also there was a split within the Gulf in terms of what to do. And the Saudis rather support President Assad rather than have a complete Turkish or Iranian influence in the country.
There's an interesting point you made. Now the Saudi moves comes after the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain also re-established their diplomatic ties with Damascus and opened their embassies in Damascus. So the revolution is essentially dead. Long live Assad.
Yes, I think as far as the Gulf and Arab League approachment goes with the Syrian government, I think apart from Qatar, almost all the other Arab nations have relations with the Syrian government, either full diplomatic, with more than 70% of the Arab League embassies are open in Damascus, and the others have security or a discreet dialogue. As far as the support to the revolution of the opposition in Idlib, as I mentioned, apart from Qatar, there is no other Arab country that supports or recognizes them anymore.
Do you expect the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to re-establish ties and to re-accept Syria back into their membership?
So the Egyptian foreign minister and the UAE foreign minister have both publicly said that it was a mistake to throw Syria out of the Arab League. We should have kept a relationship with them irrespective of the war. There has been a quiet push to bring them back in the Arab League. And as I said, the Arab League is just a symbolic act. As you know, the Arab League, apart from talking, doesn't really do much. However, I think the symbolic act of bringing Syria back in will probably follow relatively quickly. However, bilaterally, almost all the Arab countries are already got full-blown relations with Syria, with their embassies open. As far as the OIC goes, again, if you look at the two largest they have full diplomatic relations with Syria, not just with embassies open, but actively taking part in diplomacy and helping Syria, especially in the humanitarian effort through education and health.
Now, Barack Obama's Middle East policy was quite a mess. Donald Trump had his own unorthodox approach towards the region. Is Joe Biden trying to recalibrate the mistakes committed by his predecessors?
I think so far Biden has not shown much interest in Syria. In fact, I think he hasn't even mentioned Syria in any of his speeches. So it's low on his list of priorities. Of course, you can see as far as the Middle East goes, Biden is very different compared to Trump, more in the guise of Obama, because more than half of Biden's team is Obama's team. So I think you'll see reaching out to Iran. They're trying to dampen their support for Saudi's war in Yemen. They also want the Saudis to do a rapprochement with Iraq and Iran. As far as Syria goes, I think there's been no indication yet. There's been no Syria review. They haven't even appointed a Syria envoy, unlike under the Obama and Trump administration. So at the moment, it's still very early to know what Biden will do. I think for sure the sanctions are still in place. I don't think the US will have any formal recognition of the Syrian government. But I think one thing which is very clear, unlike Trump and Obama, Biden is not really saying anything as far as Arab rapprochement with the Syrian government. Previously, the Americans were very critical of the UAE and Egypt reaching out to Damascus. Now they've dropped that. So I think that's what you'll see more of. You won't see a formal engagement, but you might see a lessening of the rhetoric, and perhaps they won't mind other countries reaching out to Syria, even if the US doesn't reach out.
Right. Now, over the last couple of months, there have been a number of tectonic shifts in the Middle East. The Saudis have been quietly speaking to Turkey. Turkey has been quietly speaking to Israel. The Saudis and the Qataris have mended their ties. How do you make sense of all this?
I think there's a realization that especially the Saudi foreign policy over the last 5 years was they had a basic carte blanche from the US to do whatever they want. Go after your enemies, start wars, forces. But I think with Biden coming in, the Saudis are very nervous and they realize that they basically need to mend their ways. The Americans will not allow them a free pass anymore. That means They need a resolution to the war in Yemen. You've already seen pressure from Congress and Senate on the Saudis to end that war. They also want the Saudis to talk to Iran because the Saudis know that the Americans are perhaps going to do a deal with Iran. So I think the Saudis are just following the winds of the Americans here, which is if the Americans are less aggressive against Iran, Saudis need to do the same. If the Americans want the Saudis to talk to Iraq and Yemen, the Saudis need to do that. And also the price of oil is low. Project is Vision 2030 and Neom City. The Saudi economy is hurting, and I think they realize they cannot be as aggressive, and they have to mend ties and have to work with the region together. And that's what we've seen MBS say, that he wants Iran to be part of the economic regional matrix rather than against it. So
now, as you mentioned, the Saudis recently met with their Iranian counterparts in Baghdad. What exactly are they trying to achieve, and in what kind of a future Iraq do the Saudis want, and why do they need Iran?
I think it's an acknowledgement on Saudi's part that Iran is a major player in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. So I think talking to Iran and trying to come to some kind of solution where they can lessen the tensions. And once they lessen the tensions, they can work on economic initiatives, because both countries are hurting economically with the low oil price. And with all their proxies in Yemen, Iraq, and Lebanon, it hasn't led to any stability. So I think for the first time, you're seeing the Saudis realize talking is perhaps better than fighting. And that's why I think we see them talking to Iran in Baghdad. And in Iraq, you'll see the Saudis open their embassy almost after 30 years. And you're seeing some fruit of Saudi's diplomacy in Iraq, where the Iraqis are slowly moving away from issues in Lebanon as well. So that's what the Saudi policy is.
Right. Kamal, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again.
All right, thanks.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Londona nam se uključio Kamal Alam, stručnjak za Siriju. Saudijska Arabija je značajno promijenila vanjsku politiku proteklih mjeseci i pokazuje naznake da je spremna sarađivati sa susjednim zemljama. Više detalja u nastavku. Idemo sada do Teherana gdje se nalazi vanjskopolitički komentator Ali Ahmadi koji će nam detaljnije pojasniti iranski pogled na odnose sa Saudijskom Arabijom. Ali, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Now, 4 years ago, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman dismissed the idea that his kingdom could somehow find an accommodation with its arch-rival Iran, saying that the mutual points that they can agree on with Tehran are almost non-existent. Yet, over the past couple of weeks, we have seen Saudi officials meet with Iranian officials in Baghdad. What exactly is happening? How do you make sense of that?
Well, a lot of things have changed over the last few years. You have a new administration in Washington, the Biden administration. You have a rising left wing in Washington, in the United States, which is taking a greater and greater interest in foreign policy. The Trump administration was kind of seen as a high watermark of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia and Saudi Arabia's regional policies. The problem is that if they weren't able to secure their interests at the time to try to become sort of the primary power broker of the region in terms of security, it's not really clear how they would be able to do that now. The timing of the talks is important, though, because it's not just about the new administration coming in. The talks started before the new administration came in. Even under the Trump administration, which was very supportive of Saudi Arabia, and according to many analysts, even the United States was basically subcontracting U.S. policy in the region to Saudi Arabia, even they wouldn't really defend Saudi Arabia against Iran. For example, if you think about some of those missile attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure, the United States didn't really react to that. They reacted to when they were attacked directly in places like Iraq with their contractors and their troops, but not to defend Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure. And that really changed the way Saudi Arabia and even the United Arab Emirates saw the American security environment in the region.
Now, are the Saudis aware that Iran has the potential to stabilize or destabilize the region through its vast network of Shia paramilitary forces? I mean, have they realized that they cannot achieve much in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq without Tehran's support or cooperation?
Well, these organizations, they have a sort of base of support of their own in those countries. How they're able to recruit. They're able to, a lot of the arms, for example, in Yemen, that the Houthis are using to fight come either from the parts of the Yemeni military that sided with them in the conflict or through the black market. Iranian support certainly gives some of these groups the ability to threaten Saudi Arabia directly, as the Houthis have done. It's worth noting that Saudi Arabia is also trying to have a detente with Turkey. It's also reaching out to countries like Syria. There is no military solution to a lot of these conflicts. The Saudis have known that, at least with regards to Yemen, for some years and have chosen to fight anyway. But they need a way out of these conflicts, and working with Iran is one way they can possibly achieve that.
Now, as you mentioned, aside from talking to Tehran, the Saudis have also been talking to Bashar al-Assad's regime in Damascus. This is interesting, as the Saudis have for years been financing and arming some of the most militant and hardline rebel groups such as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Ahrar al-Sham. Why mend ties with Damascus? Why now?
Well, basically, the Saudis understand at this point that Bashar Assad isn't going anywhere. And you saw this with the United Arab Emirates reaching out to Bashar Assad sometime earlier. They understand he's not going anywhere, and they are essentially now trying to pursue a policy where they mend diplomatic ties with Damascus, and then they try to have influence in Syria through coin purse diplomacy, through essentially deploying the vast reserves that they have to be employed in Syria's rebuilding, and are hoping to essentially have influence that way, influence they were not able to get by supporting some of the groups that you mentioned. Now, that is easier said than done. A lot of the Syrian army's military ranks have been depleted and are essentially patched in with Iranian military advisors. You have these sanctions, these human rights sanctions imposed by the West under the auspices of human rights that have really taken a huge toll on life in Syria. And so, how Saudi Arabia is going to be able to get its money in with these sanctions is not necessarily clear. It's also worth noting that ethnic sectarian conflicts, according to academic research, tend to restart again, or at least threaten to restart again, within 5 years of them ending. So the Syrian government has to take under account that if governments like this see an opening to possibly overthrow it at some point in just the few years in the future, they might take it again. And so there is not really going to be a lot of trust, but presumably this is a way for Saudi Arabia to get more influence than it otherwise would have had if it was to, for example, keep fighting.
Now, how is this rapprochement related to a decrease in U.S. interest or presence in the Middle East and their pivot to Asia?
Well, a fair amount. That's kind of difficult to say. The Biden administration has been telling anyone willing to listen that the Middle East is an afterthought for them, that they're going to focus on Asia. They're going to even like Latin America is a bigger priority for them. The thing is that other administrations have tried to do this in the past. The Obama administration had the pivot to Asia policy, and that requires putting less military resources, less attention on the Middle East. But as one Obama administration official said, even after they made that decision, they were still 85% of all of their meetings in the national security realm were focused on the Middle East. There is a lot of attention on this in the sort of higher echelons and more elites in American society, a lot of think tanks in Washington. It's just simply not as easy for them to move out of the Middle East unless they're willing to make compromises. The Biden administration, by trying to go back into the JCPOA, seems to be leaning in that direction of having some sort of detente with Iran on their own. That certainly seems to be something that's motivating Saudi Arabia, even though, as I said, the Trump administration before them were also unhappy with their performance in terms of defending them.
Right. Now, going back to these Saudi-Iranian talks, though they're still embryonic, do you think they have the potential to alter the trajectory of Iranian-Saudi rivalry throughout the Middle East?
Well, I certainly hope so. This has been good. This sort of sectarian fighting in the Middle East has been going on for some time. The two can definitely try to begin the process of reestablishing diplomatic relations, to institutionalize these talks. That would be very important. I would say you have to look at these talks, not to put, you shouldn't put too much pressure on them. You should be looking at them more like Reykjavik than like Yalta. It's not about divvying up the Middle East. It's about these two countries getting a better understanding of each other's needs, of their legitimate security needs in the region. That's what these talks should focus on, and not necessarily any big grand bargains. If you zoom out a little bit, if you think about, there has been conflict between Shia and Sunni, hostility between Shia and Sunni forever. It hasn't been like this all the time. Some people claim it has. That's just ahistorical. If things really blew up after the Iraq War began, you had a huge security vacuum in a lot of places, and then also with the Arab Spring. And so both Iran and Saudi Arabia started competing with each other much more intensely than before, and they sought, connections in their fellow Shia or fellow Sunni. And that kind of needs to calm down before the region can have some semblance of order again, and we can have something remotely resembling a security architecture in the region.
Right. Ali Ahmadi, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you for having me.
Poštovani gledalci, iz Teherana nam se uključio Ali Ahmadi, vanjskopolitički komentator. Saudijska Arabija, Irak i Iran zbog fizičke blizine i geopolitičkih ambicija dugo su bili u koliziji. Ipak, proteklih sedmica njihovi postupci pokazuju kako nema stalnih prijatelja ili neprijatelja, već da su jedino državni interesi konstanta koja definiše tok vanjske politike. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pogledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.